Hi, my name is Yona. I'm the after school leader at Field Teen Center, and I don't know if you can tell, but I read a lot. I've by no means read every young adult novel that came out in 2021, but I've read quite a few of them, and today I'm going to tell you about my top 5. Of course, this is just my opinion, but my hope is that if you are looking for something new to read and you're not sure where to start, this should give you a couple recommendations for books you might not have checked out otherwise, and books that, at least I'm telling you, are really good. So in no particular order, one book that I really liked was Bad Witch Burning by Jessica Lewis. It's about a witch named Cottrell who's really financially struggling, and it's because she's 16 and is somehow the only real breadwinner of her family. Her mom doesn't work, so Cottrell works at a restaurant, and she also does letters. And these letters are for ghosts, and they compel them to come speak to the living. People will pay her a little bit of money for it, and it helps make ends meet. She realizes very early in the story that not only can she write these letters, but she can also raise bodies from the ground. Something I liked about this story is that, as you might imagine, she faces some consequences for taking this course, but I liked her and I wanted to see her succeed. And I also felt like I understood why she was making the bad decisions she was making. So it was just a fun read. I liked it a lot. I also liked that it kind of subverted some of the tropes I'm used to for a dark, gritty urban fantasy. When you look at, for example, Holly Black, who wrote The Cruel Prince and a lot of other stories about fairies and fae folk coming into the real human world, usually the setup is that the characters are living in the real world, but dealing with magical problems. And for Cottrell, she's living in the real world and dealing with real problems like neglect at home and financial trouble. And she's solving them in a magical way. So she's still very rooted in the real world in some ways that I enjoyed. This story does get a trigger warning for neglect and abuse, especially, but there's also some violence and blood. It's a story about zombies. Another book I really liked was The Girls I've Been by Tess Sharpe, which is a thriller about teens versus a bank robber. In particular, our main character, who has had many names but is currently going by Nora, is the daughter of a con artist, and she uses these skills to triumph over this bank robber. The story went to some places I didn't expect, and I was just riveted. I read the whole thing in about a day, couldn't put it down, needed to know what would happen. And I really enjoyed the way the story cuts back and forth between things going on during the bank robbery and things that happened to Nora in her past and what she learned and how she was hurt by her mom's cons. And I thought that both the past and the present were equally really tense and compelling. I also really liked the queer representation in this story. We have a couple characters who are openly bi and talk about it. And although romance is not a huge part of the story, there is definitely a very prominent relationship between two girls. So if you're looking for that kind of thing, I definitely think that this story will give you enough to go on in that department. Once again, this story does get a trigger warning for neglect and abuse, which is discussed in quite a bit of detail, and stabbing. Another book I really liked is Somewhere Between Bitter and Sweet by Laeken Kemp, which I would say is equal parts about being Latinx, the restaurant industry, and falling in love. Pen works in her parents' Mexican restaurant and she loves it and honestly wishes she could start an offshoot bakery and can't understand why they won't let her get more involved in the business. Instead, she's been going to college, or at least she's been telling them she's going to college, and when she finally comes clean and admits that actually she isn't, her dad kicks her out of the house and she is left living on her own for the first time and trying to make ends meet. Meanwhile, they hire Xander, who is an undocumented immigrant from Mexico, to work in the restaurant. He and Pen meet and really hit it off, despite the tension between Pen and her dad at the restaurant that he now works at. And as their relationship develops, they both start to realize that there is a loan shark who has been really threatening and being aggressive towards the restaurant, and that is why her dad didn't want her to get involved. So you'll have to read this story if you want to find out how things go between Penn and Xander and what happens with this restaurant and the loan shark. I really enjoyed it, and that's all I can tell you. I liked both of the characters. It made me hungry, and I thought that the ending was surprisingly hopeful. Another book I really enjoyed is The Electric Kingdom by David Arnold. And this is a weird one. There's a lot going on in this story, so you're just gonna have to trust me that these are good things. It's set in the not so distant future in a world that has been ravaged by genetically modified flies that swarm. And these swarms are so big, they blot out the sky. They just kind of eat everything in their path, and they can even like lift things into the air as they're eating them just because there's so many of them. So all of the characters live their lives around the rhythms and the inner workings of these flies, trying to avoid them, trying to avoid the terrible flu that they carry. And our main characters are traveling through this world for various reasons. One of them is trying to find out if this story that her father always told her is true, and if it might lead to a way out of this situation that the world is in. Some of them are looking for other places that their parents told them about, that they're hoping still exist, and they're not sure what they'll find when they get there. And they're all really just living on what little hope there is and trying to make a future for themselves. The story jumps back and forth from a couple different perspectives, and there's time travel. But mostly this is a story about stories and how they can pull us through a dark time and just how they make our lives meaningful. So if you really liked books like Inkheart that play with stories within stories, you'll like this book. There is some violence, there's character death, and there's some gruesome stuff related to flies and fly flu. So keep that in mind going into it, but I do highly recommend this book. It was a doozy. Last but not least, I also really enjoyed Darling by Kate Ankrum, which is her retelling of the Peter Pan story, but set in Chicago and spun as a thriller. I think a lot of what I liked about this book is the aesthetic. We've got punk Tinkerbell, we've got Detective Hook instead of Captain Hook, and therefore all the teenage characters are kind of coming up against the cops. We've got this long, beautiful scene about drag culture in Chicago, and they're all dressed as mermaids. I just thought it was a lot of fun. It had a lot of the nostalgia and the fun of Peter Pan while saying something new about it, which I thought was really neat. I hope you'll check out some of these books if any of them sound even remotely interesting to you. And I would also love to hear what your favorite books from this year were. You can message us on Instagram in our DMs, or you can email us. And of course, you can always visit us in person at 1901 Vine Street. We're on the ground floor, and we're open Monday through Friday from 1 to 5 p.m. Those hours may change in the future, so keep an eye on the website and on our social media for any changes to that schedule. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Happy reading, and I hope you have a great day.